Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you may be watching this. My name is Matthew Petrusek. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University, and welcome to another episode of Reasons to Believe. So today's theme is ultimately about something good. It's ultimately about the best possible thing, and that is life properly understood, life in its fullness. However, in order to get to that topic, that specific theme, and that's how to defend a culture of life, we have to pass through some darkness first. Not because we want to, not because it's something that gives me any pleasure to do, but because it's real. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. Now, what I'm talking about here is the culture of death. That's not my title. That actually comes from the great St. John Paul II. One of the major themes of his papacy was showing how the Catholic Church, properly understood, the Catholic faith properly understood, represents the culture of life against what he saw as the birth of the culture of death, especially as that takes root in a period called post-modernity, which I'll explain in just a moment. Now, why do we have to talk about this? I'm old enough now to have seen some very massive changes in my own life in the culture. Now, I think one of the great sort of arcs of justice in life is that you always end up talking like your parents, right? When you get old enough, you start saying things like, my gosh, I sound exactly like my dad. And one of the things that I hear myself saying is, you know, back in my day, to our own children, things were better. But here's the thing, you know, my dad wasn't right when he said it, but I'm right when I say that. Back in my day, things were better. And just in general, in this specific sense. When I think back to the kind of television that I watched, when I think back to the kind of music that I listened to, when I think back to the kinds of conversations that I had with my friends, now, of course, we always have to control for our memories, which will sort of clean up the ugly things of our past sometimes and hide them and just sort of make the past glow. Of course, no time is ever perfect. But for what it's worth, you didn't see the kind of death and destruction then that you see now. For example, if somebody would have told me when I was 15 or 16, when I was just even becoming aware that something called abortion even existed, that someday somebody would get up on the stage of a major award show, I think it was the Academy Awards, and celebrate how she had gotten on with her career only because she was able to get an abortion, and then get applause for that, I would have said, that's crazy, that's absurd. That would never, ever happen, right? Or if someone told me, you know, someday in the country you live in, upwards of 50,000 people a year will die of opioid overdoses, and life will basically carry on as normal, as if nothing's happening, I would have said, well, you know, that's insane. Of course, if there was such a massive decay of the culture to the point where there's literally tens of thousands of people dying from avoidable deaths, there would be some sort of national emergency, right? Well, here we are, right? That's happening right now. I mean, it's really gotten to the point where my wife and I, we can't let our children watch the kids' TV networks because of the kinds of things that they see, both on the shows themselves and in the commercials. And so I asked myself this, how did this happen? I mean, it's not like I wasn't entertained watching the TGIF shows back in the 90s, which were basically very sanitized. I was laughing. I was having a good time. I wasn't missing anything. So how do we get from there to here, where we have the celebration of libertinism and, in some senses, which I'll explain in just a moment, death? It's the culture of death. It's the logic of the culture of death. The dominant culture at large is not only living these values, but celebrating these values and overtly stating that if you disagree with the values of the culture of death, which they call freedom, right? They call this freedom. They call this liberation. But if you disagree with this, then you are a hater. You are a bad person. You, at best, are worthy of shame and scorn, and at worst, don't belong, right? And so what I want to do is compare that understanding of reality to the culture of life, refracted through the thought of St. John Paul II, but also recognizing that that just basically represents the teaching of the Catholic Church. So first, a word about culture and what I have in mind here. It's been recognized, and this is one of the insights of the great St. Augustine, that in order to know a people, in order to define a people, in order to define a group, examine not what they say, but what they worship. Because here's the thing. All of us have to worship something. Again, this is an insight from St. Augustine, also picked up later by St. Thomas Aquinas. In this particular sense, we all worship something. How do we live our lives? Everything that we do has some kind of goal attached to it, right? So I do what I do because I have something that I want in mind. Now, that goal, in turn, has another goal attached to it, and that goal has another goal attached to it. So, for example, I could say, and I use this to explain this idea to my students, the reason you come to class today is because you have a goal of getting participation points, but that's not your ultimate goal in life. The reason you want participation points is because you want a good grade in the class, but that's not your ultimate goal in life. The reason you want a good grade in class is because you want a high GPA, and the reason you want a high GPA is because you want to graduate with honors, and the reason you want to graduate with honors is because you want to get into a good graduate program. You can see where this is going, right? And you want to get to a good graduate program because you want to get a good job and so on and so forth. But here's the thing. At some point, all those goals have some kind of final goal that they're all after. And what St. Augustine argues, again, you can see this in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas as well, is that final goal, well, it's either one of two things. Either that final goal is some form of self-worship, meaning you do everything that you do because you ultimately have made yourself into your own God and are seeking to amplify and augment your own existence to the greatest extent possible, or it's because you actually want to worship the true God, a God that is actually God and not something, a false God in time and space. Well, the culture of death, what fundamentally defines the culture of death, and this is what St. Augustine would have called the city of man, is that ultimately everything that we do within the culture of death ultimately has its final reference point either in the worship of the self. So for me to get out of existence, to squeeze out of existence everything that I want from it, or more and more so, to live in such a way that I give myself over to some group, right? This is actually a more modern conception, postmodern conception of it, and I'll explain that in just a moment. The idea is that in the culture of death, you're not living for anything transcendent. You're not living for anything that's ultimately beyond time and space. So, the goal of the culture of death, and again, we're going to compare this to the goal of the culture of life, is either yourself, your own individual life, or your connection to some group that sort of swallows you up. Now, this is what's called in a postmodern context. Now, we could spend lecture after lecture after lecture trying to identify sort of the history of ideas and how we got to the point, but this is the only thing that really matters for our sakes and purposes. To say we're in a postmodern period means that we're in a period in which we've moved beyond, generally speaking, in terms of the basic ideas that have saturated the secular culture, that there's no such thing as objective truth. There's no such thing as moral truth. There's no such thing as human reasoning functioning in such a way so that it grabs onto principles and ideas and values that objectively exist. Rather, postmodernism asserts all values, all truth is completely relative. It's relative either to a group, so groups have their own cultures within them, and those cultures have their own values, and so you only believe what you believe because you happen to have been born in this particular family, in this particular community, in this particular nation, at this particular time. So we're all like a piece of plastic that just sort of gets imprinted with the values of our time and place. That's the group model of this idea. Or that's called cultural relativism. Or there's individual relativism, which is basically the idea that every single human being that exists creates his or her own values. I mean, each one of us is literally a world unto ourselves. And as if we were truly our own God, we make up our own morality. That's the context of the contemporary culture of death. So the goal is to live according to that reality, that there is no ultimate reality, and that it's either the individual or the group that defines your goal beyond the goal, beyond the goal, beyond the goal. Okay, so that establishes the foundation where we start from, where we're going. The question then is, well, what are the characteristics of this culture? How does it get where it's going? How does it carry out its mission or anti-mission, if you will? Well, the first one I just explained. The first step in establishing the culture of death is to relativize truth and relativize value. Again, to say that there's no such thing as a true truth, or there's no such thing as a true good, or a true right, or a true wrong, that all of that either depends on the group or the individual. Now, I want to pause here and emphasize something. This is true about the culture of death, and it's true about the nature of sin more generally. We can trace this all the way back to Genesis and the fall. Sin is attractive. Evil is attractive. And oftentimes we see evil portrayed as this sort of monstrous kind of manifestation that terrifies you. Now, I think that's fair. That's a fair portrayal insofar as the actual reality of evil. But the presentation of evil, the way that evil breaks into our life, always, or at least almost always, takes the form of what? Something enticing. So in order for a culture to shift over time, in order for it to become worse, it's not going to happen by people introducing ideas that terrify people. No, it's going to happen by introducing ideas that people find enticing. And one of the most enticing ideas that can possibly be introduced to a people is what? You are your own God. You can literally do whatever you want to do because there is no truth, so you can create your own truth. And since you can create your own truth, you can create your own vision of what you want to do with your life. And insofar as you can create that, you can create your own paradise. Right? It's a very enticing idea. You mean that all these rules I'm being told are just external impositions on my autonomous will and what I want to do? Yes. Liberate yourself, right? Or the other path, but it has a similar endpoint, is to say, well, look, if you're the kind of person who feels that you need to live for some kind of cause, let me tell you, friend, you can live for a cause, but that cause is ultimately going to be some cause within the world. So it's going to be ultimately living to die for some group, right? Whether that's a political group or a racial group or whatever, however you want to cut it up, you give yourself to the group. All right, so again, potentially very enticing. Well, that's how these ideas not only slip into the culture, but begin to take root as well. It's step number one. Because if you can't relativize truth, meaning if people still believe that there is actually a true truth out there, and that not living in accordance with that truth would mean living according to a lie, if you can't give people a plausible belief that they can lie to themselves that that's not true, well then the culture of death will never take root. So that's step one. Step two, and this follows from step one, is you have to relativize human life itself. So first you relativize the truth and the value, then you relativize human life itself, and here's how you do it. Insofar as there's no such thing as the true, the good, right, you can now say that there's no such thing as an objective value to human life, which actually would include your own life as well. And then the only principle that you have for making any kind of decision, and this then refers back to the relativity of truth and value, is what? It's your choice. You choose not only what's good, you choose what is valuable. You choose when life begins. You choose when life ends. You choose what population matters and what population doesn't matter. And again, this can be broke down into the individual and the group, where we could say it's a subjective thing where ultimately individuals make their own choices about when human life begins, when it ends, how much value it has. And we can say that groups can also make those kinds of decisions as well. Either way, human life is relativized. It doesn't have absolute objective value. Step 2. Step 3, and again, these are all related, is you relativize the family. If there's no truth, then there's no objective value to human life. And if there's no objective value to human life, then the unit that exists to produce new human life and to protect new human life and to educate new human life, also known as the family, becomes what? It becomes just another neutral choice, amoral choice that a person can make among any other potential choice that can be made. So even the basic act of reproducing, of creating new children, gets relativized to where it's, again, one thing you can do or not do. Either way, it doesn't matter. And if you choose to do it however you wish to do it, insofar as you can create whatever family structure that you want to, because there's no such thing as a true family structure. Now, of course, the ultimate consequence of that is what? Families dissolve. The idea that of a man and a woman coming together to create new life, and that itself creating a new unit that then relates to other units in society that then form communities, that then form broader communities. Well, if you take out that building block at the very bottom, if you take that foundation of the family and you just ultimately create these sort of groups of absolute choice, not living according to any fixed standard of the good, well, then the family dissolves, but of course everything else dissolves as well. Ultimately, what happens then is that freedom, understood in this model, in the culture of death, is just what you desire. It has no connection to any reality that goes beyond your desire itself. So, again, this can sound very enticing. It's not surprising, in a sense, that these ideas have been able not only to be present in society, but actually come to redefine society, because it creates all these enticing ways of living. Okay, we'll show how those enticing ways of living are actually ultimately end in death more in just a moment. Okay, well, how does that compare with the culture of life? Instead of relativizing truth and value, the culture of life recognizes objective truth and value. Now, I want to put heavy emphasis here on recognizing. To recognize something is to perceive something that exists objectively. Not that you create, but that is there, that precedes you and even goes after you. So when you come into contact with the truth, you haven't made that truth. You have seen it, you've apprehended it, and then your goal is to what? To live according to it. That's the basis of the first step of the culture of life. Now, all of this, and I'll get to the other steps here in just a moment, but all of this ultimately, whereas the goal of the culture of death is the self or group as your highest good, so this is also kind of a form of idolatry, the ultimate goal of the culture of life is love of God and neighbor. Right? So it's the exact opposite of the culture of death in every way, but that includes in its final goal. Right? Your goal is to live for a reality that transcends you, that goes before you and transcends you, and then ultimately permeates every dimension of your life in terms of how you live it, both how you regard yourself and how you regard others. Love of God and love of neighbor. So the first step is you recognize there is an objective truth. The second step is that you protect human life. Why? Because one of the truths that you recognize within the culture of life is that human life has independent value, irrevocable value. What I mean by that is that the culture of life recognizes that human life has dignity, right? Independent of what anybody says or anybody does. Within the culture of death, it is literally the case that two people the same day, one person can be having a baby shower and another person can be getting an abortion. The children can be the same age, right, within the womb, and one is being celebrated and the other is going to end up in a medical waste container. Right? So again, choice in the culture of death determines everything. In the culture of life, independent of what people say they want, life has value. And life has value because it's grounded in ultimate reality, just ultimately God himself, okay? So instead of relativizing human life, it protects human life. And insofar as you protect human life, the question then becomes, well, what do I do in order to do that? How do I protect human life? Well, the first thing you have to do to protect human life is to generate new human life, right? So the family then becomes the cornerstone of the culture of life, and the protection of the family becomes the basis for any other kind of social organization to exist. Now, hearing all this, especially if there's any atheists or any agnostics or any even Catholics who hear this kind of language and say, this sounds harsh to me, this sounds divisive, this sounds judgmental. Why are you being so condemning in this culture, right? Shouldn't we all just be united? Well, the first point to make is I'm condemning an idea here, not a person. But this idea, unfortunately, is and will continue until it's opposed to have massive influence on society. Okay? So this isn't about individuals, this is about ideas. Second, it's because if you actually care about human life, and this is one of the fundamental principles of Catholic social thought, if you actually care about human beings flourishing, then we can't ignore this reality right here, the culture of death. It leads to death in two fundamental ways. The first is bodily death. And I've already mentioned abortion. Again, 25% of pregnancies in this country right now end in abortion. 25%. But it doesn't stop there. It also includes euthanasia. And euthanasia starts off with this idea that it's just for individuals who are in unbearable pain, who want to end their life. And so the euphemism is even lived death with dignity. But then it gets pushed beyond that to this idea that, well, you know, if human beings are autonomous, right, and they have choice, why should they have to be at the end of their life because of some terminal illness? Why shouldn't we allow people to end their lives whenever they want, however they want? Which is actually beginning to happen in some European countries already. It's getting expanded. So it's at the very beginning of life, it's at the end of life, and then it becomes the center of life as well. And then it also attacks the very generation of life at the level of people even choosing to have children. Look at the birth rates in the countries that live according to these values. Look at them. They are dying. The societies are dying. Within a few hundred years, they won't exist anymore because people aren't having children. So in a very literal sense, in terms of people's bodies, the culture of death kills. Okay? But it doesn't just kill the body. It also kills the soul. How? Ultimately, the culture of death is saying to you, you get to choose whatever happiness, whatever definition of life that you want to. Again, that sounds exhilarating, but think back to the garden, right? The fall in Genesis is because this exhilarating idea that I could be a god. But what? Of course, it's a lie. The creature can't become the creator. So once we begin embracing that lie, and we say to ourselves, I can create any idea that I want to because no true idea exists beyond what I create, then we can tell ourselves, I get to live any way I want to, which again sounds great until what? Until we ask ourselves, well, how should I live? And then the answer is, well, according to how you feel. And then we say, well, okay, but how do I feel? And then we look inside ourselves and see this torrent of cross currents, each one pushing us and pulling us in a different direction. And ultimately we have the realization, I don't have any purpose or meaning to my life. Nothing is real. Any choice that I make is ultimately completely arbitrary. So why keep living at all? I've brought this point up several times and it's worth repeating over and over again. We are passing through a massive spike in suicides in our country, and it's not an accident. Once you embrace this, you take away from people the reason to live, and once you take away the reason to live, then death becomes not only one possible choice, but an overbearing option, especially when things go bad. So to conclude, if we really want to help each other, if we really say we care about our neighbors, then we have to fight for the culture of life. Because it's only by rejecting this and embracing this that we have any hope whatsoever of having true moral progress, true individual and social peace. Thank you.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.